Welcome back, chess fans. Thanks for joining me here on my channel, Steven Sturgill. Let's take a look at a fantastic game played by the late great Paul Keres versus the late great former world champion Max Euwe. I apologize if I didn't pronounce that correctly, but at any rate, of course, Max was a mathematics professor, I believe, and well, Paul was the uncrowned king, the Pope of chess. Paul II, named so after Paul Morphy, who should have, could have, and would have been world champion had World War II not happened, in my opinion. But let's get into it. This was played at The Hague in Moscow in 1948. So obviously long before ChessBase and computers, at least personal computers of any kind, existed. In theory, was not nearly so developed as it is now. With that in mind, I think they still played an extraordinarily high level, albeit a very humanistic and not artificial intelligence level. So let's get into it. This again was played in the Spanish. Okay, get my board running. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6, bishop B5, A6. Bishop A4, knight F6. Now, of course, the main line, guys, you can just go ahead and kick the bishop immediately with B5, and you're going to place your bishop on back to B3. Play D6, or maybe even D5 at some point. Get your bishop out, castle, and it's a pretty even game. But let's see. So instead of that, Max placed knight F6. Paul castled. Max munched the knight on E4. D4, very aggressive. Obviously, asking Black, in this case, Max, what do you intend to do about E5? Max said, what do you intend to do about your bishop? Okay, back to B3. D5. Pawn takes. Bishop E6. And Queen E2. Now, Queen E2 is certainly a playable move, and it was probably much more in vogue at that time than it is now. Again, not that it's a bad move. It's certainly nowhere near a bad move, but it's probably fairly far from the ideal move in this position. Instead, let's look at several, or at least a few moves that Paul could have made that would have been significantly better. They would have given White just a bit more pull and a little bit more accuracy in the position. Let's start off with bishop E3. I don't believe this move is much better, just ever so slightly, if at all. But it's a move, and it allows this type of continuation. Bishop C5, Queen D3. For example, Queen could have gone to E2 or even E1. Castles. Knight C3, or indeed Knight BD2, which may be just a tad more accurate than Knight C3, for the reason that you're boxing in the pawn on C2. Takes, bishop takes, Knight E7, Queen C3, hitting the bishop, bishop backs up. Here, yeah, it's just accurate to exchange here, get these bishops off. And basically, you would see this type of maneuvering endgame, and yeah, both sides really are ultimately going to trade down at some point, most likely trade queens at some point, and you'll be left with some type of pawn structure that may give White just a little extra pull, but certainly there shouldn't be any win in sight, if that makes sense. And conversely, as long as White doesn't do anything ridiculous, Black should have a fairly easy draw in most situations like this, positions like this. But let's back up to, oops, Okay, yeah. So instead of queen e2, knight bd2 also, I think, was significantly more accurate. Not yet the best move. We'll get there in a second. This would have led to play something like somewhat similar to the last line we saw. Queen shoring up, helping to protect f2 from unnecessary trades. Takes with the bishop. Castles. Rook d1. Maybe c3 here is a bit more accurate. Nothing wrong with rook d1 though, but c3 is probably just a tad more accurate because it's giving some pretty good protection for b4 and d4. Okay, bishop f3, f4, shoring up e5, bishop b6, rook d1 now, and so on and so forth. And again, you're going to have a very decent maneuvering game with pretty standard and common positional ideas, very thematic in the Spanish. If not c3 here, what else? Again, rook d1 is fine. I'm also wondering about this is supposed to be a bad move. I'm wondering, is it really so bad? Probably. It's probably too weakening. At any rate, what else? Can white play rook e1? Yes, and indeed rook e1 is a fine move as well. But backing up, now we'll get to the best move in the position. Oops. Okay, yeah. Here I believe that c3 played immediately is probably the most accurate move. Oops. Now, just as an aside, if black wasn't paying attention and played b4, just thinking I'll tickle the pawn and I can take back, here's probably what would happen. Bishop a4, pinning the knight. That's first. Not foremost, but it's first. And if you try to save the knight with bishop backing up to d7, queen snacks on that pawn on d5. Knight up. Now not this. You would not play this. Although this is still very, very good indeed because you're going to win this knight on e4, for example. Okay, so that's fine. And also, especially, not this. However, unfortunately, this position is so bad, even that is actually fantastic after that type of exchange. And even though you've allowed the bishop to take off, your light squared bishop, this is just game over. I mean, black can resign, obviously. But more accurate is to bring the bishop back to b3, threatening mate in 1. This leads to pretty much a forced variation. Then you have this. Again, the queen is still hitting e5. Bishop comes off. Take that bishop. Allow the knight to come back in. Bishop gets loose with a tempo on the queen. Queen backs up to c8. Knight d4. Knight e6. Knight c6. Knight munches on the bishop on g5. Knight comes off. And I'm going to stop annotating because this is so ridiculously god-awful bad. It's just a matter of pretty basic technique. Just going to rush through some of this. And that's mate. Cute mate. A little bit long-winded, but whatever. Mate in 38 from wherever we started from is certainly not bad. Of course, you would have had resignations in a real tournament game, obviously, at some point, probably long before mate ensued. Okay, let me just click. That's going to take too long. Okay, what else? Okay, again, that was only if black was asleep at the wheel and pushed b4. Now, bishop c5 would be a proper continuation by black. Now here you would probably see queen e2, castles, bishop b3. Again, we're seeing a lot. I want you to understand, guys, that when you play the Spanish over and over and over, ingrain it in your mind. In most cases, your white bishop will end up back on b3, whether or not it's taken or exchanged. And so often you absolutely must put your dark squared bishop on e3. In most cases, I'm not saying every case, but in most cases it's important to control that diagonal. You want to exert influence, because sometimes if black is asleep at the wheel or too adventurous and forgets to cover that diagonal with his own bishop, in many cases you can win important tempos by playing something like bishop c5 or bishop b6, depending on the exact arrangement. And again, I will also say that knight b1 can often will either come to c3 or d2, and that is extremely thematic, common, normal, and good. And likewise, once your back rank minors are cleared off the back rank, your two rooks, your twin towers of long range goodness, often will either come to c1 or d1, some cases even e1 or even b1, again depending on the exact requirements of the position. And then this might go on rook e8, bishop c5, knight takes, knight d4, takes. Knight will munch that bishop, as we discussed. A crosses b, now with an semi-open a file for white. Oops. Bishop backing up to c7, trying to keep an extra grip on b5. Also, X-raying a4, I might add. And you might play something like f4, b4, queen e3, b8, rook b8, excuse me, knight d2, rook e1, and so on and so forth. And you're going to have very sort of typical. Here we're seeing. Really, this is becoming somewhat of a case of dark square domination by white. And I guess it's fair to say, to some extent, I don't want to say light square domination by black, but certainly a lot of influence being exerted into white's camp via those white squares or light squares, as the case may be. But that knight is a very tricky piece, and you're going to look for tactics, you're going to look for positional strategies. But all in all, black should still be able to hold this position with proper play. Let's back on up to what Keres actually played. Again, I believe he played queen e2, if we go back. Oops. Yeah, right there. Queen e2 on move 9. Bishop e7, preparing to castles. Rook d1. Castles. c4. Quite aggressive. Maybe not the most accurate move in the position. Not a bad move at all. Extremely aggressive. And I'm not going to examine every single nuance, or we'd be here literally for a week at least. And then, yeah, bishop takes because of the pen. Bishop c5, hitting the very weak f2. Bishop seeking a trade. Trade. Queen comes up to e3. Black queen goes to b8. Back up your bishop. Paul backs it up to b3. Knight e5. Queen d2. Knight d2, excuse me. Trades. Rook takes d2. Knight takes. Pawn takes. And again, we've got that thematic. So often, just par for the course, knight takes on b3. Again, that's usually where white's bishop is. Not all the time, but usually. In the majority of cases, let us say. Rook c8. Rook c1. c5. Rook takes. Queen takes. So we're really starting to liquidate pieces and really dumb down into the endgame proper. Queen takes b3. Knight d3. Queen back to b7. Little bit of an odd move for Max. Somehow felt semi-passive, a retreat like that. Still feels like he's slowly allowing Paul to come into his terrain, and he's not really doing much to go into Paul's terrain, if that makes sense. h3, creating luft, also prohibiting the bishop from freely entering in at some point onto h3. Rook d8. Not a good move, guys. Rook c8 was way more accurate, winning a tempo against Paul's queen on c5. I don't really know precisely what the idea with this move was. I'm guessing, and it's just a guess, that he wanted to somehow try to hold d5 after knight takes e6, I'm guessing. But Paul played king h2, prophylaxis, g6, not the highest, not the best move in the position, but it is a move, and it does provide some luft for Black's king. f4, maybe not. Well, it's up there. It's one of the better moves for sure. I'm not sure if it's the most precise, but it's good enough, that's for sure. h5, not. Now this really overextended Max's kingside pawn structure. Not to mention, that doesn't help his dark square security at all. So that was fairly strange in this position. Not sure what he was thinking. Much better would have just been a rook b8, rook e8, rook c8, even rook f8. Well, I don't know about rook f8, but the other ones were certainly. At any rate, let's move on. Rook d3. Queen d7. This also was another strange, slightly weakening move. Not fully. In this position, the queen is cut off from the a6 pawn. It's not really hitting anything. Maybe he's trying to overprotect f5. I'm not sure. Just a bit of a nuance. Rather a strange move, but it's going to get a lot stranger in a second. Paul plays queen b6. Not the most accurate move, but he's prodding Black, saying, what are you going to do? Rook a8. Rook a3. Now getting somewhat of a grip on Black's position, and certainly exerting a lot of influence on the a6 pawn in particular, and just on the a file in general. White's position really has no real weaknesses that are assailable. Queen a7, and here probably honestly best was either queen takes a7 immediately or queen b4. He did play queen b4, so that's a fine move. Probably queens coming off was just a bit better. You can look at that on your own time, on your analysis. But it's fixing to get real weird in a second. But queen back to d7. Queen back to a5. Bishop f5. Rook c3. Not the most precise move in the position, but I guess just by hand and by eye, he figured, well, if nothing else, I can put some influence on c7. Maybe get something cooking. And if he plays rook c8, I take, and now you can't snack on a6. I don't know. At any rate, rook a7. This was really bad, guys. This is positionally, although not a blunder, this was what I call a positional howler. And the reason has to do with geometry. Let's look for a second before we go further. Black's queen, right? And rook. They're aligned, and that's fine and dandy, but there's a key difference. Black's king is still checkable. Technically, I'm not saying you would do that here, but just bear with me. The main issue, obviously, is that besides things like e6, at some point, and the ideas of knight takes e6 or knight takes f5, there's now a severe weakness in terms of, the rook lift coming to c6, a6, and with that knight still ensconced here on d4, how will Black really, really maintain control of a6, without getting into some kind of severe trouble? He's really probably not. But here, Max, I don't know if Max was in time trouble here. Paul played rook c5. Now really saying to Black, I'm coming for d5. What are you going to do about it? That's fine. Max says bishop e4. No problem. Queen c3. Now forming a battery. Queen h7. This was the worst move probably possible in the entire position. Certainly one of them, if not the worst. This here. And can you guess the next move that Paul played and Max resigned? Yeah, it's not hard to see. Knight c6, game over, and they signed score sheets. That's a horrible way for a former literal world champion to go out in the game. This move here, was maybe holdable, at least in a practical sense. Still very bad for Black, but possibly salvageable. You could pray that you might have gotten out of this position in one piece, and you might have gotten there. You play this move, and it's game over instantly. Bam. Thank you very much. Come again. You're just simply going down too much material here, and for a possible continuation, let's look what could have and would have happened here. Not going to waste too much time. Yep, and that's it. That would be mate. So I thought this was a very interesting game. A lot of good positional and strategic ideas. The Spanish is easily one of the oldest and best and still used today at the highest level in chess. It can be a great tool for extremely strong players if they're fighting someone at or near their level. They can generally hold the game, thereby attaining a pretty safe mechanism for drawing. If they're playing someone that's a couple of hundred rating points beneath them, well, then they should know a lot more theory, and they can probably at some point hope to trick, via tactics, win some huge crushing tactical blow, and just end the game often fairly quickly. So it is a very tactical game, but it's also very positional. I don't think Spanish sometimes gets the credit that it deserves for being extremely positional, but there is a ton of concrete theory. I would say that there is still some new ground being trudged up thanks to both Leela Chess Zero and Alpha Chess Zero and other up-and-coming programs as well that are beginning to make other types of advances not previously seen in older variations. So I did think that was very interesting. We can run back through the game very, very briefly. And we're going to close the vid out like this. I'm not going to make any more commentary. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, this was Paul Keres versus Max Euwe, and played at the World Championship 18th in the 18th World Championship at The Hague in Moscow in 1948. Enjoy. Catch you next time on my chess channel, hopefully, if not somewhere else. Yeah, and again, that was the point that Max resigned. Thanks so much, guys, and hope to catch you soon. Bye-bye.